Have you ever felt emotionally tired in a way you couldn't fully explain? Stay tuned for why. Why am I emotionally exhausted? Maybe one of the most important questions women physicians can begin asking honestly. Welcome back to the Resilient MD, the podcast and YouTube channel where we have honest conversations about medicine, burnout, resilience, and how to care for others without losing ourselves in the process. I'm Dr. Anna McDowell, certified life coach, allergist, and your host. Today's episode is about something surprisingly powerful. Over the past months, we've talked about misalignment, exhaustion, emotional labor, identity, self silencing, invisible load, uncertainty, truth telling. But more than anything, we've been learning the language for experiences many women have carried quietly for years. I have noticed that one of the most powerful moments in personal growth is not necessarily when your entire life changes, but when you finally realize, oh, that's what this is. When confusion becomes language, when heaviness becomes understandable, when your internal experience finally starts making sense. The moment you finally have words for something you've been feeling for a very long time. Because one of the most disorienting parts of emotional exhaustion, burnout, misalignment, or chronic overfunctioning is not simply the experience itself, it's the confusion, the inability to fully explain what feels wrong, the sensation that something inside you has shifted, but you can't quite articulate it. And often, until we have language for our experience, we tend to turn that confusion inward. We blame ourselves. We question ourselves. We minimize what we are feeling. But something profound happens when vague discomfort finally becomes understandable. You will stop feeling broken. You begin feeling aware. And today, I want us to reflect on that together. One of the reasons so many women stay stuck emotionally is because unnamed experiences often get interpreted as personal failure. Before you understand what emotional labor is, you think, why am I so exhausted all the time? Before you understand misalignment, you think, maybe I'm just ungrateful. Before you understand chronic self silencing, you think, why don't I know what I want anymore? And before you understand invisible load, you may simply believe, I should be handling this better. This is why language matters so much, because language organizes experience. It transforms vague suffering into something visible and understandable. Because once you can identify an experience clearly, it stops feeling like a personal defect. For example, there is a huge emotional difference between saying, I'm failing, and realizing I've been emotionally overextending myself for years, right? Those are not the same thing. One creates shame, while the other creates understanding. And once something becomes understandable, self compassion becomes possible. One thing I've noticed repeatedly, especially among women physicians, is how much gets normalized over time. Things that should feel heavy become just part of life. Chronic exhaustion becomes normal. Constant emotional caring becomes normal. Suppressing your own needs becomes normal. Functioning while disconnected from yourself becomes normal. And because everyone around you may also be functioning this way, it becomes even harder to recognize that something deeper is happening. So instead of asking, is this sustainable? Many women ask, why can't I handle this better? That question alone reveals how quickly women internalize systemic and emotional strain as personal inadequacy. One of the things I hope listeners have experienced throughout the season is this: awareness does not always change your circumstance immediately, but it changes your relationship to your circumstance. For example, you may still have the same schedule, the same clinic, the same responsibilities, but now you understand why constant emotional management is exhausting, why overfunctioning drains you, why suppressing your needs create resentment, why chronic self-abandonment eventually creates numbness. And understanding creates space, not immediate solutions, but space. Space for honesty, space for discernment, space for self compassion instead of self criticism. Quite frankly, one of the most healing experiences a person can have is this: the moment their experience finally makes sense. Not because everything changes instantly, because it doesn't, but because confusion begins to soften. You realize, oh, this is why I feel so tired. This is why I feel resentful sometimes. This is why I don't recognize myself lately. This is why I feel emotionally flat. And often that realization brings relief. Not dramatic relief, quiet relief. The kind that says, I'm not crazy, I'm not weak. There's actually a reason this feels so hard. And to be fair, that matters deeply because many women physicians have spent years functioning beautifully externally while internally feeling disconnected, overwhelmed, emotionally exhausted, quietly trapped. Because many women have spent years criticizing themselves for experiences that were never properly named. When experiences remain unnamed, they tend to merge with identity. For example, instead of saying, I am experiencing burnout, people often say, I am burned out. Instead of, I've been chronically overfunctioning, they think, I'm just bad at managing life. Language creates healthy separation. It allows you to observe your experience instead of becoming consumed by it. And this is incredibly important emotionally because once you can observe something clearly, you become more capable of responding with compassion instead of self judgment. You stop interpreting every emotional struggle as evidence of personal failure. As we close this awareness season, I think it's important to pause and reflect on what may have become clearer. Perhaps you now recognize what drains you more deeply, what no longer fits, where you overcarry, where you chronically override yourself, how much invisible labor you've normalized, how often you've confused survival with alignment. Perhaps you've also started recognizing your own emotional patterns, your nervous system responses, your internal signals, your need for spaciousness, slowness, or softness, not as weakness, but as information. And honestly, this kind of clarity changes people quietly over time. I also believe it's important to acknowledge that many women have known certain truths internally long before they could articulate them externally. Sometimes the body knows first. You feel heaviness, resistance, emotional exhaustion, numbness, disconnection before your mind fully understands why. And often it takes time before those experiences become fully speakable. Not because you're avoiding truth, but because emotional understanding unfolds gradually. Sometimes language arrives slowly, one realization at a time. Just keep in mind that awareness does not require impulsivity. And this is where many people become frightened. Once they finally see something clearly, they worry, now I have to change everything. But that is not necessarily true. You do not need to quit immediately, reinvent yourself overnight, have every answer, explain your process perfectly. Sometimes awareness simply means you can no longer pretend not to know what you know. And that alone changes the way you move through your life more consciously, more honestly, more compassionately toward yourself. Have you ever noticed how emotional it can feel when someone describes your experience perfectly? Sometimes people cry not because they just learned something new, but because they finally feel understood, even internally. Especially for high achieving women who are used to functioning, performing, helping everyone else, minimizing their own emotional experience. There can be something profoundly validating about realizing this experience has a name. Other women feels the same too. I'm not alone in this. Language interrupts isolation, and isolation often intensifies suffering. Before we move on, I want to pause for a moment. I'm curious, have you been feeling exhausted, discouraged, or frustrated and not quite sure why? Are you quietly wondering if this is just how life in medicine has to be? Well, I see you. You don't have to give up on yourself or your dreams. And the good news is that you don't have to figure it all out alone. I built a 6-week one-on-one coaching program designed to help women physicians gently remove the barriers keeping them stuck and rediscover clarity, balance, and purpose. It is called the Resilient MD, just like the podcast and YouTube channel. If you're ready, you can begin today. Schedule your free clarity call. The link is in the show's notes. There's something profoundly powerful about finally being able to say, this is emotional exhaustion, this is resentment, this is overfunctioning, this is misalignment, this is chronic self-silencing. Not because labels solve everything, but because language reconnects us to ourselves. For many women, this season was not really about learning new concepts. It was about recognizing themselves inside words they had never previously used. And sometimes that recognition feels like finally finding yourself after years of functioning on autopilot. One of the quiet shifts that happens after emotional understanding develops is this: you begin relating to yourself differently, more gently, more honestly. You may still have responsibilities, stress, difficult decisions, uncertainty, but now you understand yourself with greater precision. And that changes the emotional experience significantly because self-compassion becomes much easier when your suffering makes sense. Instead of, why am I like this? You begin asking, what have I been carrying? What has been unacknowledged? What have I normalized for too long? And those questions create openness instead of shame. I observe many women underestimating how transformative it is to accurately describe their own experience. Because when you can name what you feel honestly, something important begins happening internally. You start trusting yourself more. You stop overriding every internal signal automatically. You stop dismissing every emotion as weakness. You stop assuming your discomfort is irrational. And this does not mean reacting impulsively to every feeling. It simply means you begin treating your internal experiences as valid information instead of constant inconvenience. That is a profound shift. As we move toward the next quarter of this butterfly year, something important begins to shift. Because once you can name what's real, you naturally begin asking a different question. Am I allowed to honor this? Am I allowed to need rest, to want more spaciousness, to stop over caring, to change my relationship with work, to disappoint expectations, to include myself in my own life? And this is where the next phase begins. Not awareness anymore, permission. This month we've been talking about voice without force. And as it turns out, one of the strongest form of voice is not loudness, it's clarity. The quiet ability to say, this is hard for me. This no longer feels sustainable. I've been carrying more than I realized. Something in me wants a different way of living. Not dramatically, not defensively, just honestly. And often, before we can speak those truths out loud to others, we first have to learn how to say them honestly to ourselves. People expect transformation to feel dramatic, but often the deepest transformations happen quietly. You become more honest, more attuned, more compassionate toward yourself, less willing to abandon yourself automatically. And those shifts may not always be visible externally right away, but internally, they are profound. The butterfly does not become itself all at once. Transformation happens gradually through awareness, through honesty, through listening. And whether you realize it yet or not, you are already changing. If this season has given you anything, I hope it has given you language and you started finding words for experiences you once struggled to explain. Language for what felt confusing, language for what felt invisible, language for experiences you may have carried silently for years. Because once you can name what's real, you begin relating to yourself differently, with less shame, less self-blame, more compassion, more honesty. I hope you recognize how meaningful that truly is, because understanding yourself more clearly is not small work. It changes the way you relate to your own exhaustion, your emotions, your needs, your boundaries, your future. And often healing begins not when everything is solved, but when something finally makes sense. Because once you can name what's real, you stop fighting yourself quite so much. And from that place, something new becomes possible. Not force, not urgency, permission. My wings grow when I listen. If this episode resonated with you, share it with a colleague who might need to hear it too. In next week's episode, we will take a deep dive on what has happened in the first 6 months of our butterfly year journey. I will take a pause to explore the quiet internal shifts that happen during all these healing and transformation. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. But before you go, don't forget to grab the free People Pleasing in Medicine Reflection Guide. It is a gentle space to slow down, reflect, and reconnect with yourself again. You can download it at the link in the description below. Your feedback means so much. If you found today's episode helpful, please consider leaving a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or your favorite platform and liking the video on YouTube. Every single one helps this podcast grow and support more women like you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your honesty. And thank you for allowing yourself to become more deeply understood, especially by yourself. I'm Dr. Anna McDowell, a resilient MD just like you. I'll see you next week.